freezing winter morning in an American town. A 16-year-old girl stood at the bus stop, leaning on the crutches that had become part of her life ever since a tragic accident stole her father and left her body scarred. She wasn't fragile. Her father, a soldier, had trained her in martial arts and resilience since childhood. But grief had made her battles heavier, and every step through the snow carried the weight of memory. That was when the bully appeared again. Overweight, cruel, and shielded by privilege as the son of a deputy secretary, he carried a knife with a deadly reputation, a weapon whispered about for its violence. He mocked her, cornered her, and raised the blade. But destiny has a way of revealing its hand at the darkest moment. The growl of bicycle tires cut through the cold air, and one by one, riders closed in, surrounding the bully in a circle of justice. What looked like random cyclists was, in truth, the beginning of a revelation that would expose long-buried secrets. A conspiracy, a cover, and the truth about who really caused the accident that killed her father. If you were standing at that bus stop, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The winter sky over Denver sagged low and gray. The kind of bitter morning where the wind gnawed through wool coats and snow crunched like broken glass beneath boots. Emily Carter moved slowly along the sidewalk, her crutches clicking against the icy concrete with each careful step. At 15, she had the bearing of someone older, forged not only by discipline, but also by grief. Her hair, chestnut brown and falling to her shoulders, framed a face that once radiated youthful cheer, but now carried a solemn intensity. Her hazel eyes were sharp, alive with both determination and the shadow of pain. For every step she took reminded her of what had been stolen from her. 2 years ago, Emily had been different, athletic, full of boundless energy, the girl who stayed late at the school gym perfecting her kicks or sparring with boys twice her size, encouraged by her father, Captain James Carter, a career soldier. James had been a man of formidable presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw perpetually shadowed with stubble. A voice that could command a room yet soften into warmth when speaking to his children. He had carried the scars of his service, both physical and invisible. But he believed discipline was the key to survival. He taught Emily martial arts from the time she was 7, instilling not only technique, but a warrior's mindset. Never let fear decide your fate. That lesson became the echo she clung to the night he died. The memory still haunted her in flashes. The sound of screeching tires on wet asphalt, the blinding headlights cutting through drizzle, her father's hand tightening on the steering wheel as the other reached across to shield her, and then the crushing impact. James Carter died instantly, his body shielding Emily from the worst of the blow. She survived with fractured bones, torn muscles, and weeks of drifting in and out of consciousness. The man who drove drunk that night was never caught, or perhaps never intended to be caught, for whispers suggested the case had been buried, evidence erased. Emily, too young then to understand conspiracies, only knew the ache of loss and the bitterness of betrayal. Now she lived with her mother, Laura Carter, a woman of 38 whose resilience belied her gentle appearance. Laura taught at the local elementary school. She wore her chestnut hair pinned neatly in a bun most days, her soft brown eyes carrying both kindness for her students and the weariness of someone who had endured too much. Life had carved lines of determination into her otherwise youthful face. She loved fiercely, but worry had become her constant companion since the night James never came home. Beside Emily and Laura was Ethan, Emily's 10-year-old brother. Ethan was thin, his sandy blonde hair always tousled, his blue-gray eyes bright yet shadowed by the burden of asthma that sometimes left him gasping for air. Despite his fragile health, he carried an eagerness to prove himself. to be brave like the father he barely remembered. Completing their small family was Ranger, a German shepherd of 4 years, muscular and alert, his thick black and tan coat gleaming even in the winter gloom. His ears stood high, his amber eyes intelligent and protective. Ranger had been James's companion during long jogs and morning drills. And after James's death, the dog transferred his fierce loyalty to Emily and her family. Ranger seemed to sense Emily's pain, often nudging her with his nose when she faltered on her crutches, or standing guard at the foot of her bed when nightmares woke her. This morning, the three of them trudged together through the icy street toward the bus stop. Emily's breath misted in the air, her chest rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of perseverance. Ethan carried both his backpack and part of Emily's, refusing to let her bear the extra weight, though his small shoulders sagged under the load. Laura had already gone to work, her day beginning earlier than theirs, and Ranger padded loyally at Emily's side, his nose twitching at the scents carried by the wind. But Emily's thoughts were not on the cold or the burden of her crutches. They were on him. Mark Reynolds. 17. Overweight but deceptively strong, with a round face that still managed to look cruel thanks to the perpetual smirk twisting his lips. His father, Robert Reynolds, was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, a man with connections too vast and power too heavy for anyone in Denver to challenge. Mark wielded that privilege like a club, strutting through school halls as though he owned them. His varsity jacket stretched tightly across his broad frame. His dark hair was always slicked back with too much gel. His eyes small and mean, filled with the smugness of someone who believed the world owed him submission. He had made Emily his favorite target since her return to school after the accident, mocking her limp, her crutches, calling her cripple in front of crowds. His laughter, booming and cruel, still rang in her ears at night. She hated him, not just for the humiliation, but for the way he reminded her of her own vulnerability. And today, as snowflakes fluttered down from the ashen sky, Emily felt it before she saw it, the prickling tension at the back of her neck. Ranger stiffened, ears snapping upright, his growl rumbling deep in his chest. Emily's eyes lifted, and there he was. Mark Reynolds stepped out from behind a row of parked cars, blocking the narrow sidewalk. His varsity jacket strained against his thick chest, and his gloved hand rested on something gleaming. A knife. Not just any knife, its curved blade caught the weak winter light with a deadly shimmer. Emily recognized it from whispers. A famous combat blade, illegal in many states, designed not just to cut, but to kill. Ethan froze, clutching Emily's sleeve. Ranger barked, his hackles raised, ready to spring. "Well, well," Mark drawled, his voice dripping contempt. "Look who thinks she can limp her way to school again." "Don't you get tired of pretending you belong here, Carter? People like you should just stay home, or better yet, disappear." He flicked the blade casually, as though testing its weight. His eyes gleamed with malice, but underneath, Emily saw something else. An emptiness. A rage born not from strength, but from cowardice. Emily's pulse pounded, but her father's voice whispered in memory, "Never let fear decide your fate." She shifted slightly, planting one crutch firmly into the snow, angling her body. Her martial arts training stirred in her muscles, reminding her that even with limited mobility, awareness and positioning could mean survival. Mark took a step closer, the knife glinting. "What's wrong, cripple? Your dog gonna save you? Or maybe your little brother here?" He sneered at Ethan, who clutched tighter to Emily. "Leave him out of this," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. Inside, her thoughts raced, distance, angle. Where's my exit? She glanced at the corner of the hardware store behind her, realizing she had no retreat. The snow made her footing treacherous. One wrong move, and she would fall. Mark lunged suddenly, testing her reaction. Emily swung her crutch instinctively, deflecting his wrist just enough to keep the blade from striking. Ranger leapt forward, teeth bared, snapping inches from Mark's leg, forcing him to jerk back with a curse. Ethan shouted, his small voice breaking with fear. "You think you're tough because Daddy taught you a few tricks?" Mark snarled. "Your daddy's dead. And you're nothing." The words hit harder than the icy wind, cutting deeper than any blade. Emily's breath caught, rage searing through her chest. She tightened her grip on the crutches, ready to counter again, though her arms trembled with effort. She couldn't keep this up. Not against steel. Then, just as Mark raised the knife higher, preparing to strike, the world changed. At first it was a sound low, rhythmic, growing louder. The crunch of dozens of tires on frozen pavement, a mechanical growl rolling through the cold air like distant thunder. Emily's head snapped up. From the bend of the street, a line of bicycles emerged, their riders clad in dark coats, faces shadowed by helmets and scarves. The line thickened, spreading across the road like a tide. The rhythm of their approach was thunderous, wheels spinning, chains rattling. Mark faltered, the knife wavering in his hand, his smug face drained of color. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Ethan clutched her arm tighter. Ranger barked furiously, his body vibrating with tension. The cyclists surrounded them in seconds, a storm of motion and steel, circling like predators around prey. Tires hissed against snow, and the air filled with the sound of power and inevitability. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. Mark's hand shook as the blade glittered uselessly in the growing shadow of the riders. And then, silence, broken only by the hiss of breath in the freezing air. Emily's gaze locked with Mark's, his smirk replaced by fear, her own shock mirrored in the gleam of his knife. The question thundered in her mind as the riders tightened their circle. Who are they? And why now? The chapter ended with the blade still raised, the riders closing in, and Emily's heart pounding with a single thought. This moment would change everything. The air around the bus stop seemed to freeze in place as the circle of cyclists tightened. Emily's heart pounded as she leaned into her crutches, Ethan clinging to her sleeve, Ranger barking and snapping at the ring of figures. Mark's hand still clutched the curved knife, but his bravado drained with every revolution of tires around him. The cyclists dismounted in unison, boots crunching on the icy pavement, movements sharp and practiced. One man stepped forward, pulling off his helmet with deliberate calm. He was older, perhaps 50, his frame lean but strong, shoulders straightened by years of discipline. His face was a map of harsh lines and weather-beaten creases, the stubble across his jaw flecked with gray. His eyes steel blue, steady and unflinching, spoke of battles fought both on fields abroad and in his own heart. A long scar crossed from his left temple to his cheek, an old wound that gave him an air of gravity. His leather gloves creaked as he flexed his hands, and his voice, low and roughened by time, carried the weight of command. "Drop the knife," he said to Mark, his tone brooking no refusal. Mark sputtered, trying to summon the arrogance that usually shielded him. Do you know who my father is?" His voice cracked, the knife trembling in his grip. The man didn't blink. He stepped closer, his boot steady on the icy ground, and with a swift motion he twisted Mark's wrist, forcing the blade free. Mark yelped, stumbling backward into the snowbank, his face red with humiliation. The knife clattered on the ground, where one of the other cyclists scooped it up with gloved hands. "Your father's title won't protect you from the truth," the man said coldly, staring at Mark with the kind of contempt born not from hatred, but from recognition. Then his gaze softened when he turned toward Emily. "You must be Emily," he said, and his voice shifted, losing its edge. He studied her, her long brown hair brushing her shoulders, the crutches supporting her thin frame, the fire of defiance still burning in her hazel eyes, despite the fear moments before. "You look just like him." Emily blinked, confusion flooding her mind. "Like who?" The man's lips curved into a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "Your father, James Carter. He and I, we were brothers in arms." The word struck Emily like a physical blow. For 2 years she had believed her father's memory belonged only to her family, a silent shrine preserved in the walls of their modest home. To hear his name spoken with such familiarity, with such reverence by a stranger who clearly knew him, it was both comforting and overwhelming. "My dad," Emily's voice cracked. "You knew him?" The man nodded. "I'm David Miller. I served with him overseas. We bled together. He saved my life more than once, and when I heard what happened to him..." David's eyes flickered with grief, his jaw tightening. "I knew it wasn't right. I knew James Carter didn't just die in some accident." Mark, forgotten for the moment, scrambled to his feet, rage replacing his fear. "You'll regret this. My father will have you arrested, all of you." He spat into the snow and stomped off, clutching his bruised wrist, his threats echoing down the street. None of the cyclists moved to stop him. Their silence was louder than any pursuit. David knelt down to Emily's level, his scarred face illuminated by the dull winter sun. Ranger sniffed at him warily, then licked his gloved hand, tail wagging, as if recognizing something trustworthy in the man's scent. Emily's breath trembled. "You're saying my dad's death? It wasn't an accident?" David glanced at Ethan, whose wide eyes mirrored his sister's fear. His voice dropped, gravelly with truth. "No, it was no accident. James Carter was targeted." He was silenced. Emily felt the ground sway beneath her, as if the snow itself had shifted. For 2 years she had carried the weight of loss. But now another weight pressed on her chest. Suspicion confirmed, dread realized. But why? Who would... "Not here." David cut in gently but firmly. "It isn't safe to speak on the street. Come tonight. My place. We'll talk that evening." After convincing her mother Laura with halting words and a determined stare, Emily limped through the snow-covered streets with Ethan and Ranger at her side, arriving at a modest cabin near the edge of town. The cabin was weathered but sturdy, its walls lined with firewood, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of burning oak, and the walls were cluttered with relics of military service. Faded photographs, medals tarnished with age, maps pinned with notes. David sat by the fire, his leather jacket draped over a chair, a steaming mug in his hands. Without the helmet, his salt and pepper hair revealed more gray than black. His eyes ringed with sleeplessness. His presence filled the room, not with menace, but with quiet strength. "Sit," he urged, gesturing to the couch. "You deserve to know the truth." Emily sat stiffly, her crutches resting against the armrest. Ethan clung to her side, while Ranger curled protectively at her feet. David stared into the flames for a moment before speaking. "Your father wasn't killed by chance. He knew something dangerous. Something people in power would kill to keep hidden." He drew a deep breath, his voice heavy with memory. "And I know, because they tried to do the same to me." Emily's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" David's gaze hardened, his hands tightening on the mug. Years ago, I had a wife, Claire. She was warm, kind. Her laughter could fill a room. And our boy, Adam, he was 10, curious, fearless, always asking about the stars. They were my world. And one night, as we were driving home, a bomb tore our car apart. I was thrown clear by some miracle. But Claire and Adam, his voice cracked, the scar on his face twisting as grief resurfaced. They didn't survive. The explosion wasn't random. It was planned. It was punishment. Because James and I had uncovered something we were never supposed to see. The fire popped, embers glowing as silence wrapped the room. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, both for David's loss and for the revelation that her father's fate was tied to something larger than tragedy. "Who?" she whispered. "Who would do that?" David's jaw clenched, his voice turning cold. The same man who hides behind polished suits and government titles. Robert Reynolds, the deputy secretary. Your bully's father. Emily's heart stopped for a beat. Ethan gasped, and even Ranger growled low, as though the name itself carried danger. The fire in David Miller's cabin crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Emily sat rigid on the couch, her thin hands clenched on her knees. Her hazel eyes wide as the words David had spoken echoed in her head. Robert Reynolds. The name, so tightly tied to her tormentor Mark, now loomed in a far darker light. Ethan shifted beside her, clutching his inhaler as though it were a talisman. While Ranger growled low, his ears pricked as if he too sensed the danger carried by that name. David leaned forward in his chair, the orange glow highlighting the deep scar across his cheek. He no longer seemed like just a veteran burdened by grief, but a man carrying a truth too heavy for one soul. His steel blue eyes held hers. Robert Reynolds didn't just sign papers in Washington. He built an empire from shadows, an empire of lies. Your father stood in his way, Emily. That's why James Carter had to die. Emily's breath hitched. She remembered her father's smile, the way his strong arms had lifted her high into the air when she was little. His patient corrections during martial arts drills, his voice saying, "Strength isn't about winning every fight, it's about knowing which fights matter." Now she realized he had been fighting one of the biggest battles of his life and had lost it in a burst of headlights and steel. David rose slowly, his tall frame moving to a locked cabinet tucked in the corner of the room. He pulled out a weathered metal briefcase, its surface scarred and dented. With a click of the latches, he opened it to reveal files pages yellowed with age, photographs, and even a small external hard drive. "This," David said, laying the documents on the table, "is part of what James found." He was investigating a covert program one Reynolds had his hands all over. It was supposed to be a defense initiative, advanced weaponry, new tactical gear, drones meant for reconnaissance. But what Reynolds did was turn it into a black market scheme. He diverted military contracts, sold technology to private buyers, and funneled funds into off-the-books projects. James discovered the trail. He collected evidence. Emily leaned closer, her chestnut hair falling forward as her eyes scanned the grainy photos. Shipments of crates stenciled with military codes, soldiers in uniform loading them onto trucks at night, blurred images of men shaking hands in dimly lit warehouses. One picture showed a familiar figure, Robert Reynolds, his sharp features caught mid-smile, his hand extended to someone whose face was just out of frame. David's jaw tightened as he pointed at the image. Your father knew this could never see the light of day. He kept a duplicate of everything. That's why they came after him. And when I tried to help, they came after me too. His voice faltered, the memory of his wife Claire and young Adam rising in his throat. He cleared it harshly, pressing on. Emily's hazel eyes burned. So all this time, people thought it was just a drunk driver. My dad was murdered because he was protecting this country from corruption? David's gaze softened. Yes, he stood for integrity when men like Reynolds stood only for power. He died because he refused to be silent. Ranger suddenly barked, sharp and insistent, his amber eyes darting toward the window. The wind outside moaned, rattling the shutters. But David strode quickly to the glass. He peered into the snow-swept night, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of a pistol holstered beneath his jacket. His face was granite when he turned back. We need to be careful. Reynolds has eyes everywhere. His men patrol these streets in plain clothes, watching, listening. If word spreads that James's daughter is asking questions. Emily swallowed hard. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that her family's suffering was not yet over. Her voice trembled, but anger steadied it. Then let them come. I won't let him erase my father's name. Not again. David studied her, seeing not just the fragile girl with crutches, but the steel her father had forged. For a moment, he almost smiled. You've got James in you. That fire. But don't let anger blind you. This path is dangerous, Ethan piped up timidly, his small voice breaking the tension. Mr. Miller, if Mr. Reynolds is so powerful, can't we tell the police or the army? David crouched, resting a heavy hand on Ethan's narrow shoulder. His face was grave. Kid, men like Reynolds own the police in towns like this. And the army? He's their superior. To them, he's the one giving orders. Going through official channels would only get more people killed. That's why we have to be smart. Careful. Ethan's eyes widened, his chest rising fast, and Emily rubbed his back to calm him. Ranger pressed closer, resting his heavy head on Ethan's lap, grounding the boy with his quiet strength. Emily clenched her fists. Inside her burned both grief and fury. She thought of Mark's sneering face that morning, the glint of the knife in his hand, the cruelty in his laugh. Now it wasn't just cruelty born of arrogance, it was the offspring of something darker, rooted in the corruption of his father. She looked back at David, her voice firm. What do we do? David exhaled slowly, his scar pulling tight as his jaw set. First, you need to understand the whole picture. James left a trail. Not all of it is here. Some of it, he hid, and Reynolds knows it. That's why he killed your father, why he bombed my family. He's still looking for it. If he finds it first, the truth dies with us. Emily's mind spun. A hidden trail. Evidence her father left behind. Somewhere, perhaps in the very places she walked each day, the key to exposing a man who wore power like armor still waited. She felt the weight of the crutches under her arms, the ache in her legs, but for the first time in 2 years, the ache was drowned by purpose. Her hazel eyes hardened. Then we'll find it before he does. Ranger barked sharply, almost as if agreeing, his body rigid, hackles raised. David's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Emily. His voice was low, grim, but tinged with admiration. Good. Because if you're serious about this, there's no turning back. Once we start, Reynolds will come for us all. The fire popped loudly, casting sparks up the chimney. Emily sat taller, her young face fierce in the flickering light, the shadow of her father's courage rising in her. And outside, the wind howled through Denver's streets, carrying with it the sense of unseen eyes and ears already closing in. Snow continued to fall over Denver like a curtain drawn by an unseen hand, muffling the city's sounds beneath a heavy white hush. Inside the Carter home, Emily stood before the window, her crutches balanced under her arms, staring out at the frozen street. Her hazel eyes were stormy, shifting between determination and unease. Since that night at David Miller's cabin, the world felt different. Every shadow a possible spy. Every knock on the door a threat. Laura Carter, her mother, moved quietly in the kitchen, her chestnut hair tied into a bun, her tired hands preparing dinner, while her mind weighed heavier things. She had noticed the change in Emily's fear. More steel, but it frightened her as much as it reassured her. She had lost James. The thought of losing Emily to a battle against powerful men made her stomach twist. Meanwhile, Robert Reynolds was pulling strings across town. In his late 50s, he was a man of imposing presence. Tall, broad-chested, his dark suits tailored to perfection, his iron-gray hair combed neatly back. His square jaw was clean-shaven, but deep lines etched around his mouth betrayed decades of ruthless ambition. Reynolds was not just a politician, he was a strategist, a manipulator who believed loyalty could be bought and fear could be engineered. Behind his sharp blue eyes burned a hunger for control that had only deepened after James Carter had threatened to unravel his empire. At the Denver Police Department, Reynolds' influence was visible. Sheriff Alan Briggs, a man in his early 60s with thinning white hair and a protruding belly, had once been a respected officer known for fairness. But years under Reynolds' shadow had eroded his spine. Now his watery gray eyes avoided confrontation, and his once firm voice faltered when issuing orders. Briggs attended quiet dinners at Reynolds' estate, drank his expensive whiskey, and learned to turn a blind eye when Reynolds' men patrolled the streets under the guise of neighborhood security. There was one exception among the uniformed ranks. Deputy Marcus Hale. In his mid-30s, Hale was tall and lean, his short black hair cropped tight, his jawline angular with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. His eyes, dark brown and steady, watched everything with suspicion. Hale had grown up in Denver's working-class district, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs after his father abandoned them. Years of hardship carved resilience into him, and unlike Sheriff Briggs, Hale could not be bought. His reputation in the department was mixed. Some admired his integrity, others saw him as a liability. And Reynolds, keenly aware of Hale's independence, kept him at arm's length. Emily, however, had little thought for the men in suits or badges. Her focus shifted toward the training David insisted she resume. At first, she resisted. Her injuries had left her body frail, her legs unsteady, and every fall in the snow felt like proof of weakness. But David was relentless. "Your father trained you for more than tournaments," he told her, his scar catching the light as he adjusted her stance. "He trained you for life. You don't get to let Reynolds steal that too." So each evening, Emily met David in the abandoned lot behind his cabin. The ground was frozen solid, snow layered like powder over ice, but it became her new dojo. David corrected her form with the precision of a soldier, his gravelly voice cutting through the cold. "Balance isn't about legs. It's about the core. Use the crutch as an extension, not a crutch. Make it a weapon," Emily tried. She stumbled, slipped, and sometimes fell to her knees, snow biting through her jeans. But she rose each time, driven by the memory of her father's lessons. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his frail chest wheezing, but his eyes glowing with pride as he clapped whenever Emily managed a clean strike. Rangers circled nearby, barking encouragement, sometimes playfully darting in to act as a sparring partner, dodging her slow kicks before licking her hand in triumph. David's training was grueling. He pushed her not just physically, but mentally. forcing her to anticipate attacks, to read intentions before they manifested. He explained tactics from the battlefield, how to use terrain, how to turn an enemy's weight against them. Emily absorbed it all, her muscles aching, but her spirit igniting. With each session, she shed another layer of helplessness, reclaiming the strength she had thought buried in the wreckage of the crash. But as Emily grew stronger, Mark Reynolds grew darker. Humiliated by his defeat at the bus stop and furious that his knife had been wrenched away by David, he seethed with vengeance. Mark was 17, overweight with a face still boyish, but twisted by cruelty. And yet his arrogance had been cracked. Now, instead of mere taunts, he plotted. He gathered a group of schoolmates, other boys impressed by his money and name-arming them with threats and cheap blades. Mark's anger made him reckless, his bullying more dangerous. He cornered younger students in hallways, shoved Ethan against lockers, and whispered promises of revenge into Emily's ear whenever he caught her alone. Sheriff Briggs looked the other way. To him, Mark was untouchable, a boy shielded by his father's title. Complaints vanished from police files. Teachers warned students to keep quiet. But Deputy Hale noticed. He saw the bruises on Ethan's arm, the fear in students' eyes. And when he saw Emily practicing one evening with David, curiosity tugged at him. Hale wasn't sure yet what battle lines were being drawn, but he recognized courage when he saw it. One snowy night after training, Emily sat on the cabin steps, breath steaming, muscles trembling with exhaustion. David crouched beside her, his scars sharp in the moonlight. "You're improving," he said. "Your father would be proud." Emily wiped sweat from her brow, her cheeks flushed, her chestnut hair damp. "Sometimes I feel him here," she whispered, "like he's watching." David nodded slowly, his eyes shadowed. Maybe he is. Or maybe it's his lessons living in you. Either way, that fire, you have to hold on to it. Because Reynolds won't stop. And neither will his son. As if summoned by the thought, Ranger's ears pricked, and he growled softly, staring into the darkness beyond the lot. Emily followed his gaze, but the shadows revealed nothing. Still, a chill crept over her spine. She knew Mark was out there somewhere, waiting, plotting, and she knew his father's reach stretched farther than the snow-covered streets of Denver. The power games had begun, and Emily could feel it. Her family was now on the board, whether they wished to play or not. The snow on Denver's rooftops gleamed silver under the pale moonlight, as Emily Carter climbed carefully up the narrow staircase to the attic. Her crutches clicked softly against the wooden steps, and the smell of dust and cedar filled her nose. Ranger trotted behind, his claws scratching against the wood, his ears twitching as if sensing the importance of what was hidden above. David Miller followed close, carrying a flashlight, his scarred face tight with concentration. Ethan brought up the rear, clutching a blanket against the cold, his blue-gray eyes wide with nervous excitement. Emily had never liked the attic. It had been her father's space, a place where he stored military gear, training pads, and stacks of old journals. Since his death, Laura had rarely gone up there, leaving it frozen in time, like a shrine of silence. Emily's hazel eyes scanned the shadows, her chest tightening with memory. She remembered her father's laugh echoing up here, as he fixed an old punching bag, his large hands adjusting her stance as she practiced kicks. The emptiness hurt, but beneath it burned purpose. Somewhere here, he had hidden the truth. David knelt at the far corner, pushing aside boxes marked with faded handwriting. His flashlight beam glinted off something metallic wedged beneath a loose floorboard. With steady hands, he pried it free, a small steel lockbox, its edges dented, its surface coated in dust. His voice, gravelly but reverent, filled the attic. He left it for you, Emily. James always knew Reynolds would try to bury everything. He made sure you could finish what he started. Emily's hands trembled as she touched the box. Ranger nudged her arm gently, as if urging her to be brave. She set it on an old trunk, and with David's help, opened the lid. Inside lay an external hard drive, wrapped in cloth, along with a folded letter in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Her breath caught as she unfolded the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but James's words were steady, firm, and full of the same resolve he had always shown her. If you are reading this, Emily, then I am gone. This drive holds proof of what Reynolds has done. Give it to someone who will not be silenced. Do not trust the police. Do not trust the military. Only truth and those who still honor it can protect you. Be strong, my little warrior. I believe in you. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, blurring the words. She pressed the paper to her chest, her heart aching yet steadying. Ethan sniffled, hugging her tightly. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but resolute. This is enough to bring him down. But we can't keep it. Reynolds will know you have it. We need someone outside his reach. That someone was introduced to them 2 days later. Claire Donovan, an investigative journalist in her early 40s. Claire was a striking woman with sharp cheekbones, shoulder-length auburn hair streaked with gray, and emerald green eyes that missed nothing. She had once been a television reporter, but left after refusing to bow to corporate sponsors tied to government contracts. Now she ran her own small but fearless news site, writing exposés that rattled politicians and corporations alike. Her voice was crisp, confident, carrying both warmth and bite, and her thin frame seemed fueled by endless coffee and restless nights. They met in the back room of Laura Carter's bookstore, its shelves heavy with old novels, the scent of paper and ink wrapping around them. Claire studied the hard drive with care, her brows furrowing. "If what's on this is what you say it is," she murmured, "this could bury Reynolds. Maybe even pull down half his allies in Washington. But it also paints a target on all of us." She looked at Emily, her emerald eyes softened. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Emily lifted her chin, her chestnut hair falling back from her face, her hazel eyes fierce despite the shadow of fear. "My father died for this. I won't let it be for nothing." Claire nodded slowly, admiration flickering across her face. "Then we'll expose him together." But Robert Reynolds was not a man easily cornered. Word reached him through channels faster than Emily could have imagined. In his grand office, lined with mahogany and military portraits, Reynolds listened as one of his aides whispered about a missing hard drive. His jaw tightened, his blue eyes glinting with rage. "Find it," he commanded, his voice icy. "And if anyone has it, silence them." That night, as the bookstore's warm lights flickered against the snowy street, Laura Carter locked the door and began tidying the counter. Her soft brown eyes lingered on a picture frame of James holding Emily and Ethan, her chest tightening with longing. She didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. 2 men in dark coats slipped inside, their movements precise and practiced. One was tall and broad, with a shaved head and a scar across his lip. The other shorter, wiry, with restless eyes that darted around like a predator's. Laura gasped. But before she could scream, a gloved hand covered her mouth. Ranger, who had been lying near the counter, sprang with a furious snarl, his muscular frame colliding with the taller man, teeth sinking into his sleeve. The man shouted, trying to shake him off, while the wiry one shoved Laura into a chair, binding her wrists with plastic ties. When Emily and David arrived minutes later, guided by Ranger's frantic barking outside, the bookstore was in chaos. Shelves toppled, books scattered, the window cracked. Laura was gone. Only claw marks in the snow outside hinted at the struggle. Emily's heart thundered in her chest, fear mixing with fury. Her crutches nearly slipped on the icy pavement as she cried out, "Mom!" But only silence answered. Ranger whimpered, nose pressed to the ground, then barked at David, urging him to follow the trail. David's scarred face hardened, his steel blue eyes narrowing with grim resolve. "They took her to force us to give up the drive. Reynolds is making his move." He looked at Emily, his voice steady despite the storm outside. "We don't have a choice anymore. We go after them." Tonight, Emily clenched her fists around the crutch handles, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that no snow could smother. For the first time since her father's death, she felt not just grief, but purpose. She looked at David, then down at Ranger, who growled, ears pinned forward, ready to fight. "We'll get her back," Emily said, "no matter what it takes." The night was sharp with ice, the kind that burned in the lungs and stung the skin. Snow blanketed Denver's outskirts, and the moonlight reflected coldly against the skeletal frame of an abandoned military supply warehouse. Its rusted walls rose from the frozen ground like a monument to forgotten wars. But tonight, it was no relic. It was a battlefield. Emily Carter stood just beyond its gates, crutches sinking slightly into the snow. Her hazel eyes glowed in the dim light, no longer trembling with uncertainty, but steady with purpose. Beside her, Ranger growled low, his powerful body tense, amber eyes trained on the warehouse doors. David Miller stood at Emily's other side, his tall frame clad in dark layers, his scar illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. His steel blue eyes were narrowed, his jaw locked. Behind him, the cyclists' veterans who had once ridden with him in uniform and now rode together again in quiet defiance, waited in silence. Their breath fogged in the frigid air, their presence solid as stone. Inside the warehouse, Laura Carter sat bound to a chair. Her soft brown eyes burned with both fear and defiance, her wrists raw from plastic ties. Across from her stood Robert Reynolds. Dressed in his immaculate black coat, his iron-gray hair slicked back, his face calm but his eyes sharp, he resembled a general surveying his field. Two armed men flanked him, their rifles gleaming in the dim light, while another paced nervously by the door. His son, Mark Reynolds, hovered nearby, his varsity jacket stretched tight across his thick shoulders, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. In his trembling hand, he once again clutched the curved blade, its edge catching the light. Reynolds placed a gloved hand on Laura's shoulder, his voice smooth and cold. "Your husband thought he could ruin me with his secrets. He failed. And now your children think they can finish what he started. Foolish, dangerous. You'll serve as the lesson." Laura's voice, though hoarse, carried strength. "You'll never erase James. And you'll never own Emily outside," David signaled to the riders. One by one, they moved into position, circling the warehouse just as they had circled Mark at the bus stop weeks earlier. Emily's chest pounded with both fear and anticipation. She could feel her father's words in her veins. "Never let fear decide your fate." She gripped her crutches tighter, her knuckles white. With a nod from David, the riders charged. Tires cut into snow, boots thundered against frozen ground, and the warehouse doors slammed open under their combined force. Chaos erupted instantly. Ranger bolted ahead, a blur of fur and muscle, his bark echoing like thunder. He lunged at the nearest guard, teeth clamping down on the man's arm, wrenching the rifle from his grip. David stormed forward, his fists and elbows striking with soldierly precision, sending another guard sprawling across the concrete floor. The veterans fanned out, their discipline overwhelming the unprepared thugs Reynolds had hired. Emily limped inside on her crutches, her eyes locked on her mother. Laura's face lit with shock and hope as her daughter pushed past the fray, Rangers snapping at heels to clear the path. Emily swung a crutch into the knee of the pacing guard, who collapsed with a cry, his weapon clattering uselessly. Her chest heaved, but her stance was steady, her father's training alive in every motion. Mark roared, charging at David with the curved blade raised high. His face was red, his eyes wild, his bulk crashing forward like a bull. "You ruined everything," he screamed. He swung the knife downward, but David caught his wrist, twisting with practiced strength. Mark fought, spittle flying from his lips, until his own force betrayed him. With a sickening slip, the blade cut across his arm, drawing blood. Mark screamed, stumbling backward, the knife dropping to the floor with a metallic clang. Emily froze, hazel eyes wide as she watched her tormentor collapse, clutching his bleeding arm. For the first time, the boy who had seemed invincible lay broken, undone not by others, but by his own fury. Reynolds's face twisted with rage as he realized control was slipping. "You think you can stop me with fists and noise?" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. But before he could act, Claire Donovan, the journalist, stepped from the shadows at the rear of the warehouse. She had followed quietly, her auburn hair tucked beneath a knit cap, a small camera held steady in her hand. Her emerald green eyes gleamed as she spoke, her voice loud and clear. "The whole world can hear you now, Secretary." Every word Reynolds froze. For a moment his mask cracked, the icy composure faltering as he realized the trap. He looked at the men around him, at the camera pointed at his face, and at his son bleeding on the floor. "This means nothing," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll bury you all." But David stepped forward, his scar deepened by the light, his voice calm and cold. "No, Reynolds. You buried yourself." The riders pressed closer, their circle tightening around the disgraced official. Laura was freed, Emily's arms wrapping tightly around her mother as tears streamed down both their faces. Ranger pressed against them, tail wagging furiously, his fur flecked with snow. For the first time in years, Emily felt the weight on her chest lift. The truth was no longer hidden. Her father's fight was no longer lost. And as Reynolds stood trapped in the circle of men and cameras, Emily knew his reign of power had finally ended. The trial of Robert Reynolds shook Denver and echoed far beyond its snowy streets. For weeks, his face dominated television screens, the once proud deputy secretary now reduced to a pale figure in an orange jumpsuit, his sharp blue eyes dulled by fluorescent courtroom lights. His crimes, laid bare by files, recordings, and testimonies, left no room for escape. The verdict was swift: life imprisonment without parole. Power had protected him for decades, but truth had cut deeper than any weapon. Mark Reynolds's fall was quieter, but no less dramatic. His bulky frame, once cloaked in arrogance, seemed to shrink as he was led into the juvenile detention center. The blade that had once gleamed in his hand was now evidence, his reputation as the untouchable bully replaced by whispers of pity and disdain. For the first time, Mark was alone, his father disgraced, his friends gone, his cruelty turned back on him. For Emily Carter, the days that followed were filled with a strange silence. The storm that had raged around her family for years had finally broken, leaving behind a fragile calm. She still moved with crutches, her long chestnut hair often falling into her hazel eyes as she practiced in the living room, but her steps grew stronger each week. David stood beside her during these sessions, correcting her stance with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a soldier. "Not just the legs," he reminded her. his scar tightening when he smiled faintly. Strength starts here. He tapped her chest, over her heart. Laura Carter carried her own scars, though hers were less visible. Her soft brown eyes seemed brighter now, free from the constant fear of shadows. She reopened the bookstore, its shelves neatly rebuilt, the bell above the door ringing with renewed life. Customers returned, drawn by her quiet warmth and the knowledge that she was no longer merely a widow, but a survivor who had faced down corruption and endured. Ethan flourished as well. His sandy blonde hair always stuck up at odd angles, his blue-gray eyes glowing whenever he told Ranger about the stories he read. His asthma still lingered, but with each passing month, he grew stronger, racing through the snow with the German shepherd bounding beside him. Their laughter and barking weaving together like music. Ranger thrived in this new peace. His thick black and tan coat shone in the winter light, his amber eyes alert but calmer than before. He was no longer just a protector. He was part of the healing, nudging Emily when she stumbled, curling at Laura's feet when she read by the fire, or guarding Ethan as he slept. At 4 years old, Ranger seemed wiser than his age, a silent sentinel who carried James Carter's memory in every watchful glance. And then there was David. The scarred veteran, once hollowed by grief, found himself drawn daily to the Carter home. He split wood for the stove, fixed shelves in the bookstore, taught Ethan how to throw a ball properly, and stood silently on the porch with Laura when words weren't needed. His steel blue eyes, once heavy with ghosts, softened each time he looked at Emily. She reminded him of James, not just in her hazel eyes or her stubborn stance, but in her spirit. One snowy afternoon, Emily asked him directly, "Why do you stay, David?" "You don't owe us anything." He paused, his breath misting in the cold, his jawline etched by memory. "I lost my family once. Claire and Adam were my whole world. I thought I'd never find another place to belong." He glanced at her, his scar pulling tight as he smiled faintly. "But your father gave me a second chance when he saved my life. And now, being with you, with Laura and Ethan, feels like a second chance too." Emily blinked back tears, nodding slowly. For years her heart had carried only loss. Now, for the first time, it carried something else. The fragile but undeniable sense of being whole again. Weeks passed into months. Snow began to thaw, icicles dripping into gutters, the promise of spring whispering through Denver's streets. One evening, as the last flurries of winter drifted lazily from the sky, Emily stood on a wooden bridge outside town. Her crutches leaned against the railing, but she was not using them. Her thin frame swayed slightly, her chestnut hair whipping in the breeze, her hazel eyes fixed forward with fierce concentration. Laura stood a few steps away, her face alight with pride and worry. Ethan clapped his small hands, cheering. Ranger barked encouragement, tail wagging furiously. David stood just behind Emily, his hands ready but not touching, his steel blue eyes steady. Emily took a breath. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, and moved one foot forward, then the other. Her knees trembled, her body wavered, but she did not fall. She walked slowly, shakily, but walked across the bridge, the crunch of her boots on the wood louder than any applause. When she reached the other side, tears streamed down Laura's cheeks. Ethan shouted with joy, hugging Ranger so tightly the dog yelped. David smiled, his scar softening as he exhaled. And Emily, standing tall, her chest rising and falling, felt the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder. Not in reality, but in the strength he had left her. As the sun rose the next morning, casting gold over snow and ice, the Carter family gathered once more on that bridge. Emily, Laura, Ethan, David, and Ranger stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the first light of a new season. They were not the same people who had begun this journey. Grief had scarred them. Loss had marked them. But together, they had built something stronger than blood. A new family, bound by pain, forged by truth, and lifted by hope. Sometimes miracles are not thunderclaps in the sky or parting seas. Sometimes they are quiet or hidden in the courage of a broken girl who learns to stand again, in the loyalty of a dog who never leaves her side, or in the steadfast hand of a friend who becomes family. In the hush of a snowy Denver morning, we see that God's grace often works through ordinary lives, weaving redemption from sorrow. Emily's first steps without crutches were more than recovery. They were testimony. Testimony that no darkness can silence truth forever, that hope can rise from ashes, and that even the deepest wounds can become the soil where love and new beginnings grow. In her family's laughter, in David's healing smile, and in Ranger's watchful eyes, we glimpse the quiet mercies heaven places in our path. And so, dear friends, as you return to your own daily battles, whether they are storms of loss, loneliness, or injustice, remember, God's miracles are still here, written in the small victories of everyday life. May this story inspire you to believe in second chances and to look for the unseen blessings that surround you. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your reflections. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so together we can spread kindness, courage, and faith across the world. May God bless you and keep you always.